let's introduce the unit circle. What the unit circle is, it is just a circle with a radius of 1. Why is this circle so important? Well, because it will help us identify the sine, cosine, and tangent of important angles, such as 30 degrees, 45 degrees, 60 degrees, and 90 degrees. And as you can see, those important angles are only in the first quadrant, but they will also repeat in the following 3 quadrants. So I'm gonna teach you today a technique for you to not memorize the unit circle. You just need to memorize the first quadrant and then be able to apply it to the other 3 quadrants. And also, not only for you to memorize it, but also to be able to figure it out in an easy way. So let's go ahead and get started with the unit circle. First thing to know is that in the unit circle, the y-coordinate is the sine, the x-coordinate is cosine, and y over x is tangent. You may ask, why is that? Well, because if we look at this circle, let's pay attention just in the first quadrant. If we take this triangle right here and we draw it right over here, we have this line here going down and then closing, forming a 90-degree angle. This side of the triangle will be the hypotenuse right here, right? Which we already said that if it is the unit circle, this is a radius, so is equal to 1. We are interested in this angle, right? Which it is the angle formed between the x-axis and the line that we are interested about. Okay, so if we are paying attention to this angle, the opposite side will be this one, and this will be the adjacent side. For sine, sine says that is opposite over hypotenuse, right? So, but the hypotenuse is already 1, and the opposite side is just the y-coordinate, right? Because here, this will be the y-coordinate, which ended up being that the sine of the angle is equal to y over 1, and this is equal to y. That is why the sine is corresponds to the y-coordinate. If we do the exact same process but calculating the cosine, remember is adjacent over hypotenuse, is again the x-axis over the radius of the circle and will be the x-coordinate. And tangent is just sine over cosine, and sine is y and cosine is x, so it's just y over x. That is why we come up with this. With this information, then we know that in the arrangement of x comma y, which is the coordinate of a point in the coordinate system, the x is the cosine and the y is the sine. Okay, so keep this in mind. Additionally, our angles of interest are going to be 0, which is along the x-axis, 30, which is this one right here, which is pi over 6, 45, which is the one over here, which is pi over 4, 60, which is this one right here, and 90, which is this one right here. Okay, these are our 5 angles of interest, and we are going to figure out how to calculate each one of them. First of all, let's start with the 0-degree angle. which is along the x-axis. When we have a point right here, our y-coordinate is 0. And remember that the radius of this circle is 1, which makes the point 1, 0. This means that the cosine of 0 is equal to 1, and the sine of 0 is equal to 0. This is what this point means. Cosine is equal to 1 and sine is equal to 0. For the 90-degree angle, which is this one right here, we ended up in a point here. Our x-coordinate is equal to 0 and our y-coordinate is equal to 1 because it's the radius of the circle. So this means that the cosine of 90 is equal to 0 and the sine of 90 is equal to 1. Okay, so let's recap that. For the angle equal to 0, the cosine of 0 is equal to 1 and the sine of 0 is equal to 0. On the opposite side, in the 90-degree angle, the cosine of 90 is equal to 0 and the sine of 90 is equal to 1. With these 2 points in mind, now let's evaluate the 30-degree angle, the 45 and the 60. As you can see here, the coordinates are given for the 30-degree angle. The cosine is square root of 3 over 2 and the sine is 1/2. For the 45, it is square root 2 over 2 for both cosine and sine, and for the 60 is 1/2 for the cosine, and the sine of 60 is square root of 3 over 2. I know this could be a little bit overwhelmed, but I'm going to give you a trick on how to get this faster. First, let's set up a table where we have sine, cosine, and tangent. And on the rows, we have 30 degrees, 45 degrees, and 60 degrees. Let's start filling out the table, and we start with the sine. We have 1, 2, and 3. And for cosine, we start, but on the opposite direction. We start 1, 2, and 3. For these two, the next step will be to square root everything and divide it by 2. So we have the square root divided by 2, the square root divided by 2, and the square root divided by 2. Same for the cosine. And with this, we already have the values for the coordinates in the unit circle. Why? Because this will be the same, the square root of 3 over 2, then square root of 2 over 2, and the square root of 1 over 2 is just 1/2. Same in here. For the tangent, it's a little bit different. We just have to write down 3, 1, 3, and square root everything. We square root this, square root this, square root this. And for the 30 degrees, we just divide it by 3. And that's it. This is equal to 1. In conclusion, we have a table that looks like this here. Okay, so with this trick in mind, let's go back to the unit circle. Okay, so what this means is, if I ask you, hey, what is the cosine of 30? Then you go to the 30-degree angle, and the cosine is the x-coordinate. Okay, so it's a right triangle right here. The coordinate in here is square root of 3 over 2. And when we go to the y coordinate is 1/2. So the sine of 30 is 1/2, and the cosine of 30 is square root of 3/2. Okay, so that you do with all the other angles. So if I ask you, hey, what is the cosine of 45? Then you go to the 45-degree angle and figure these coordinates. Okay, so for the first quadrant, that looks easy, but let's see what happened in the second quadrant, third, and fourth. Okay, so the easiest way for you to figure it out is to have a reference angle, the angle that is with respect to the x-axis. For example, when we have 150 degrees, the closest angle that is along the x-axis will be 180, right? Which is this angle right here. You have two angles that are made with respect to the x-axis. This one right here, let's mark it down. This angle right here, which is 150, and this angle right here, which is 180 minus 150 is just 30 degrees. When you have this reference angle with respect to the x-axis, it is easier for you to figure out the cosine and sine of them, and also tangent. How do we do this? Well, we already figured out that 150 degrees makes 30 degrees with respect to 180, which is along the x-axis. And then what is the sine of 30? We have it right here. It is 1/2. And what is the cosine of 30? Is square root of 3/2. But the only difference is the sine. So you can see here, the cosine is negative. Two ways on how you can figure out the sine. First of all, you are in the second quadrant, which means that the x-coordinate is negative, and the x-coordinate corresponds to the cosine of the angle. So we have negative square root of 3/2. The second trick will be that for the first quadrant, all the ratios are positive. So for the first quadrant right here, all are positive. For the second quadrant, only sine is positive. For the third quadrant, only tangent is positive. And for the fourth quadrant, only cosine is positive. Okay? Why? Well, here in the first quadrant, we are in the positive of y and in the positive of x. In the second quadrant, we are in the positive of y, which is sine, but in the negative of x. Okay, so that is why only sine is positive. In the third quadrant, both x and y are negative, so both sine and cosine are negative. But when you do negative over negative, then you end up with positive, which is tangent. Remember, the tangent is sine over cosine. Okay, so tangent is equal to sine over cosine, and both of them are negative, so it's negative over negative. You end up with a positive. And finally, the fourth quadrant is the positive of x but the negative of y, and x is cosine. So cosine is positive and sine is negative. So this way you can figure out also the signs of them if you don't have the unit circle right in front of you. So all, sine, tangent, cosine. So let's do another example. Let's say that I ask you, hey, what is the cosine of angle 240? Well, then the first thing you need to know is in what quadrant 240 is located. Well, you know that is higher than 180, but is less than 270. So it is in the third quadrant, which means that both sine and cosine are going to be negative. Okay, so the second thing to do is to get the reference angle. Remember that the reference angle is always the angle with respect to the x-axis. Okay, so for us in this case will be this angle right here, because this one will be smaller than the angle right over here. We have two reference angle. You take the smallest one, which is closer to 180 degrees. And what is that angle? Well, you go 240 minus 180, and you know that this angle is equal to 60 degrees. Okay, so now you go back to the first quadrant. Hey, what is the sine of 60 degrees? You can see here, sine is square root of 3 over 2, and cosine is 1/2. So you know now that the cosine of 240 degrees is minus 1/2, and the sine of 240 degrees is minus square root of 3 over 2. That is how you are able to figure the sine, cosine, and tangent of all the angles, the important angles around the unit circle, only knowing the first quadrant. Okay, so but don't worry, we're going to do more exercise about this topic later on. Okay, so let's recap here and write some tips down. So the first thing to know is the value of sine, cosine, and tangent of 30, 45, 60 degrees. How do we do that? Well, with using this table right here that I told you before. You start name number from 1 to 3 down, and then here from the bottom to the top, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, then square root and divide everything by 2, and then you get the values. For tangent, it's just 3, 1, 3, and then square root everything, and only the 30 degrees you divide it by 3. Also, the tangent, you can calculate it just by dividing sine over cosine, and then you get the same value. Okay, so that's the first thing, to figure out the sine, cosine of 30, 45, and 60. Then you need to know the sign in every quadrant. So we know that the first quadrant, all are positive. Then the second quadrant, only sine is positive. Then the third quadrant, only tangent is positive. And the fourth quadrant, only cosine is positive. And finally, you need to get the reference angle, and this angle is always with respect to the x coordinate. It doesn't matter if it is the positive or the negative x axis. We just need to figure out the angle to the closest point on the x coordinate, and based on this angle we are able to calculate the sine and cosine of all the angles around the unit circle. Okay, those are 3 tips on how you can handle the unit circle without memorizing.